Hello to all of you dear people around the world. This is the Elixir of Awareness channel, and you're watching the 31st episode. In this episode, we want to address an important narrative of history. Our main source in this episode is the book that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012, and the name of the book is The Swerve: How the World Became Modern, written by Mr. Stephen Greenblatt. This book is about how the discovery of an ancient Greek manuscript that had been lost for centuries helped change the world's direction. The story begins here, in the 14th century AD. One day a middle-aged man took an old book from the dusty shelf of a monastery's library. He was amazed when he first saw the book, because he didn't even think that there was a book left by an author, whose name he'd only heard. Then, with the help of a writer, and in the usual way in the 14th century, he wrote a manuscript of it and copied it. And he brought out a valuable book from the hearts of centuries of oblivion and brought it into the world full of destruction and suffering of 14th century Europe. The name of the book was On the Nature of Things, written by a Greek philosopher named Lucretius, and the content of this book was actually a long and mysterious poem in praise of life that, after being freed from the clutches of monastery, it slowly multiplied and spread and finally changed the world. This episode is about how a book hunter unknowingly resurrected a valuable and forgotten book and provided the basis for the formation of the world of modernity. This episode of the Elixir of Awareness channel is the story of a person who loves books, a book, and an important event in the history of the world. In the winter of 1417 AD, a man named Poggio was going to a remote monastery in the height of cold, which was known to keep many manuscripts of old books. It should be mentioned that the character of our story, Mr. Poggio, worked in the pop organization for years. Even he'd an important position at that time, special secretary of the Pope. But finally, the power struggle in the church caused the Pope to be removed, and Poggio was also unemployed. And maybe it's better to say that he was freed so that he could go after his old love, which was the books of ancient times. The place where Poggio and other book lovers used to hang out was the library of the old monastery. It can be said that during that time, for centuries, the monasteries were the only places where books could be found. Of course, ordinary people weren't allowed to access these books. It seemed that the monks of these monasteries weren't the guardians of knowledge, and in fact, they were the jailers of thought and knowledge, and unfortunately, they were very good at their work. They were very careful that the old books didn't get into the hands of common people, and also they themselves weren't contaminated by worldly and old books. It's interesting to know that these monasteries were deliberately built in remote places to protect the monks who lived there from the temptations and entertainments of the world. The character of our story, Mr. Poggio, had to pass through the very dangerous and impassable roads of that time in Europe to reach one of the monasteries. But getting to the monastery was the easy part, because he'd to persuade the monks by flattery, showing an introduction letter, or sometimes bribing them to let him in so that Poggio could copy from a few old books and take them out of the monastery. Poggio knew all the challenges of this path, but on the other hand, he was a very suitable person to do this work, because he'd powerful friends at the top levels of the church who sometimes persuaded them to write letters of introduction for him so that he could enter the monasteries. On the other hand, he was very funny, talkative, and sociable. He was an innate magician who could satisfy the monks with his own special methods so that he could enter the doors of the forbidden world, where all the valuable lost treasures from ancient times were inside them. The church institution had tried for hundreds of years to completely forget the books and ideas of the ancient Greek era. For example, it's interesting to know that one thing that caused many books to remain was that in ancient times books were written on parchment, and these skins had good physical durability. And because the skin was valuable and expensive, the church didn't destroy them, and using a knife, brush, or lemon acid, they erased the writings of the books they didn't like, such as the works of Cicero, Virgil, Seneca, which are masterpieces of the history of thought, and instead, for example, they were writing biographies of monks approved by the Vatican. But many times the effects of what they erased weren't completely removed, and somehow it was still readable. And it's interesting to know that some masterpieces of the history of thought were saved in this way. For example, today we've Seneca's book on friendship or Cicero's book on the Republic, only because the manuscripts weren't properly erased and their words could still be seen and read. We said this so that you know what strange conditions prevailed at that time. To better understand these conditions, it may be better to know in medieval libraries they had an important rule, the rule of silence. That is, no one was allowed to speak and make a noise like in today's libraries. For this reason, the monks had a kind of sign language among themselves, which through this way they convey their meaning to each other. For instance, if a scribe was going to say to the monk there, "I want one of the books approved by the church," such as the biography of one of the popes, he'd have to politely extend his hand and pretend to read and flipping imaginary pages of a holy book, and then shows his hand above his head as a sign of a crown. But if, for example, he wanted a book that belonged to the time before the conquest of the church, he'd put his 2 fingers in his mouth and pretend that he was nauseous. In short, as we said, in such this world, in 1417, Poggio reached a monastery in southern Germany. He'd traveled a very difficult way in the extreme cold, but he was full of enthusiasm and happiness to reach the place of the library of the monastery. To a place where the last survivors of a glorious period of human history are fighting with termites and monks and taking their last breaths. But according to the conditions governing the monasteries that we've explained to you, Poggio couldn't get to the point of the matter from the very beginning. Therefore, in the first days, he always read books praised and approved by the church and wrote copies of them to gain the trust of the monks. He also befriended them because of his strong social personality and entertained them and told them about the outside world. In fact, Poggio was a skilled storyteller, and he got so close to the monks that he instinctively realized that it was time to make his indecent proposal. That is the proposal to visit the section of ancient books.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
We don't know exactly on which day of his stay in that monastery in the south of Germany he reached this historical moment, but we only know that it was close to the evening when the conditions for entering the forbidden book section are provided. He wanders between books for several hours and at the same time tries not to show signs of happiness and excitement on his face. Even if he reads a part of a good book, he was shaking his head as a sign of regret so no one doubts him. Suddenly, he comes across a book that he'd only heard the author's name before. Lucretius. He knew that Lucretius was a famous philosopher, but no book by him had been found until then. He opens the book and realizes that the name of the book is on the nature of things. After the sunset, the night comes and the darkness covers the library of the monastery, just like the darkness of the outside world. Under the watchful eye of the monk guarding the library, who was probably in a hurry to start dinner time so that Poggio would entertain them, Poggio probably only just had time to read the first lines of the book, while he'd to hide his excitement all the time to find that precious treasure. He coolly and indifferently puts the book on top of some church-approved books that he was supposed to transcribe from, and then he jokes with the monk to change vibe, and then they go to dinner together. Imagine that the door of the library closes. Here you should hear the footsteps of the Poggio and the monk that was with him in your imagination. Here the camera has to move forward and take a close-up of a book hidden among other manuscripts, and inside that book, there's poetry that's been released from the old and dusty bookshelves to slowly change the world that Poggio and all the monks knew. Then the camera should go to the window of the monastery's library and show us a long-shot view of the outside world. The world where poverty, disease, famine, and war have destroyed it. The world that is covered by darkness. About 1,450 years before Poggio existed and set the book on the nature of things free, Lucretius' poem was circulating and being read in the ancient world. Lucretius and his poetry are mentioned in the works of many ancient philosophers and thinkers. This means that he was very popular in his time. For example, Aurelius, the great epic writer of the ancient world, in one of his books, after praising the book on the nature of things, wrote like this finally: "A day will come when the poems of Lucretius will be forgotten. But this will happen only in the dark times when the scroll of the world complicated and the work of the world is over." Regarding the life of Lucretius, we've to say that there is almost no trace of him. It can be understood that he was an isolated and introverted person who lived in the shadows all his life. and it doesn't seem that he's published anything other than this one valuable book. But from the content of this book, we can understand that he was influenced by an older philosopher than himself, Epicurus. Maybe it's better if you know a little about Epicurus. Epicurus lived at a time when every philosopher first had to answer an important question. And that question was, what's the world made of? And after answering this question, the philosophers were looking for the rest of their ideas. That is to say, the basis of the intellectual structure of every philosopher was the answer to the question of what the world is made of. Some of them said that everything was made of fire. Some said that everything was made of water in 3 states, solid, liquid, and gas, and different opinions like this. But Epicurus surprisingly believed that the world is made of atoms. Certainly Epicurus didn't know the atom as we know it today, for example. He didn't know anything about the nucleus and electron, but he hypothesized that there's something that is the smallest building block of everything, and its name is the atom. And this atom is constantly in motion, and in some special conditions they create new compounds. In fact, he said that everything in the world, such as the moon, stars, birds, butterflies, trees, and even grains of sand, is made of atoms. This idea is very important, so let's explain its results a little more. Epicurus said that when everything is made of atoms, and even the biggest things are made of the smallest particles, why don't the biggest semantic systems made by man, such as law, or government, shouldn't be made by the smallest members of society, which means people? In fact, his brilliant idea opened the way for people to participate in their destinies. Or, for example, according to his idea, when the world is constantly in motion and the law of the world is constant dynamism and transformation, why shouldn't people's lives change a little? This evolution and changes were very important in Epicurus' view. He believed that if our thoughts and ideas don't change continuously, this stability will ruin both human and society, because it's the hidden law of the world. The opinion of Epicurus, who was the intellectual model of Lucretius, was that in such a world, emphasizing the claim of knowing everything is only the work of lost people who took themselves too seriously. He believed that when we realize our own innate ignorance, then we'll live more fairly, respectfully, and cautiously toward ourselves, others, and the world. He was saying that praising life means praising the gods, taking care of life means enjoying life, and respecting life is the most important thing that humans should do. Epicurus and his intellectual students believed that a good person has 5 main qualities: kindness, courage, honesty, generosity, and curiosity. That is to say, they considered these characteristics to be superior moral virtues. Hundreds of years later, some of Epicurus' intellectual enemies tried to distort Epicurus' ideas about the enjoyment of life. For example, they tried to equate his idea with unconventional whims. But the fact is that his idea isn't really like this. Both his life and his collection of works show that Epicurus' understanding of pleasure brought a form of simplicity, purity, moderation, and friendship. In fact, we told you these things about Epicurus and his intellectual philosophy, so that the roots of the message of the book on the nature of things by Lucretius become a little clearer for you. So Lucretius also wrote his book under the influence of his ideas and thoughts. But his book is actually a long poem addressed to Venus. As you know, the ancient world was full of different gods, each of which was the embodiment of a natural force. Venus was the mother god and the goddess of life and birth in the ancient world. When most of the ancient gods were fighting with each other to prove their truth and power, and most of them were male gods, Venus, the goddess of life, was doing something else. She was fertilizing the soil, growing plants, and giving birth to animals. Actually, Venus was busy giving life to the world. Interestingly, this is why the character of Venus is a woman. In general, in different cultures, different characters that are somehow related to life are always a woman. Because in the past, men always was hunting, fighting, and killing. So the force of death is more colorful in terms of an archetype in their character. But because the woman was always a birth giver, in myths, so was more a symbol of life. It can be said the symbols of life are often female. For instance, it's interesting that even the words of phenomena related to life in different languages are feminine. For example, in the Arabic language, the sun, the earth, and the world are all feminine. Very well, let's go back to the discussion. We said that Lucretius's poem is addressed to Venus, and his book is also in praise of this life-giving force, which was completely forgotten during the period when the book hunter of our story, Poggio, was living. Let's explain more. Centuries of corruption and deviation in the structure of the church and the empire had taken the brilliant idea of Jesus Christ to heal pain and suffering to its opposite point. It means this idea had changed 180 degrees. That is to say, the reduction of suffering had become the deliberate creation and production of suffering. God, who was neither male nor female beyond gender, had only been interpreted as male and masculine by the church and monks. Gradually, God became a wrathful father who, according to the popes, was very angry with people for the original sin of eating the forbidden fruit and never forgave them. Also, the monks were saying that God sacrificed his son, Jesus Christ, to atone for our sins, and now nothing satisfies him except seeing the pain and suffering of people. And this issue was a very big deviation and created an important change in human history for centuries. This idea was the focal point of churches for centuries, and it had terrible results. Gradually, for successive centuries, the Christian world of Europe was filled with praising death and denying life. That is to say, they interpreted life and life's temptations as a curse. The body was considered an absolutely polluted thing that could only be cured by suffering. For example, it said that the Benedict, who was one of the important monks of the church, was tempted and fell in love one day, and thought of marrying a woman, and to face this temptation, he took off all his clothes and went among a thicket of nettles. And he starts rolling for a long time, until his whole body is covered with razor and blood. At that time, it was said that he was able to overcome pleasure and temptation through suffering. And this was the advice that at that time was emphasized to all ordinary people, that the way to overcome and control the body is to hurt the body and harm it. Or, for example, a nun named Sister Catherine proudly recounted how she forced girls who'd just joined the church to flog themselves until the blood flowed from their bodies. And she used to write so enthusiastically that the sound of the whips was the sweetest song that reached the ears of the god. And from the look of Sister Catherine, the scent of faith was rising from those wounds. We want to say that this way of attitude was imposed on the people by the members of the church as much as possible. Over the years, the early teachings of Christ about life, coexistence, kindness, and love had been completely forgotten, and thus death had been won over life. Even if a picture of Christ was published, it was a picture drowned in blood, wounds, pain, and sadness. The monks at that time believed that we realize that human is an inherently corrupt creature that must be constantly humiliated and punished to find a way to salvation through pain. Interestingly, they had the same opinion even about nature and the environment and all living phenomena. That is, contrary to the Eastern view, which is full of respect for nature, the church considered life to be polluted in a way. They considered the earth a penal colony, not home. The popes had concluded that everyone should pay the debt of their suffering to the God of the church, that is, to the always angry and displeased God of the popes. And they believed that it's better to do this voluntarily to be accepted. For example, if a person sinned, in the simplest form of punishment, they'd flog them in public. And the interesting thing is that before punishing them, they should kiss the instrument of punishment, or, in the words of the monks, the instrument of salvation. The important point is here that in the early years of the beginning of these violences, the monks themselves practiced austerity and punished themselves. But history shows that gradually, in a strange way, God's representatives were exempted from punishment. For example, in one article mentioned, they examined portrait paintings of powerful men of the church that were left over from the past centuries. And the interesting thing is they realize that as time goes by, they get fatter in an interesting way. And the sad point is here that these portraits were painted at a time when people were constantly involved with famine and hunger, and this is just an example of the deviation of the teachings of the church at that time. For instance, in the book Caliban and the Witch, the author mentioned that at that time there was so much famine and hunger that people were dying on the side of the street. And people took off their clothes as a sign of protest and appeared in the way of the lords in power to show their protest with their thin bodies. They didn't even have the strength to scream, and they were trying to show the depth of the tragedy by just showing their bodies, We want to say that at such a time, Mr. Poggio entered that monastery and found that valuable book. The emperor and nobles were the rulers of the people's world with all kinds of wars, atrocities, and injustices. And on the other hand, the Pope, whose name was even not mentioned anywhere in the Bible, claiming infallibility and claiming to be the ruler of the soul of the people of that time. And by this way, he used to torture God's children with humiliation and guilt in a different way. This was the image of the world in which Poggio lived. Also, because he was working in the church and observing the situation, he was gradually reaching serious contradictions. For example, Poggio was a close witness of this scene when a noble and people-friendly priest named Giron, who knew him and had no doubts about his faith and honesty, was burned alive by order of the church. The priest that Poggio testified in his heart that he's not against religion but against superstition and oppression. It said that when he was burning in the fire, he was so praying with sincerity that the bodies of all the people present in the square and Poggio were trembling. After this incident, Poggio travels to Germany under the pretext of treating his rheumatism. During that period, Germany was part of the Christian world, but due to its distance from the capital of faith, that is, Rome, its people had the chance to live more peacefully for a while. Visiting Germany was a very important experience for the book lover character of our story because it made him more curious and his interest in ancient books increased. And finally, he reached that monastery in the south of Germany in 1417 and found the book on the nature of things.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
But you might ask yourself, what exactly tells us the book on the nature of things? First, you should know, this book isn't easy. It has 7,400 lines of poetry and the language is Latin, but it's written in a complicated way that isn't too easy to read. But let's review a series of its important ideas together. One thing is that nature is very important in this book. The experience that reading these poems creates in a person is that a person feels connected with life. A feeling of connection, not a feeling of separation. It means that you see yourself as a part of this life, not the king of the world. According to Lucretius, it's very surprising that we and, for example, the most distant stars and oceans are made of the same material, or in other words, we're related. And this is a very important opportunity that we're alive, and we found this valuable opportunity to see, touch, understand, and experience this complex world as much as we can. Another feature of these poems is that they pay attention to the other side of life, that is death, in a healing way. In fact, he considers life and death to be related, and he considers these two phenomena as a cycle on which the world moves forward its base. The book on the nature of things slowly takes the hand of its audience to meet and reconcile with the phenomenon of death without fear. Because it's the fear of death that makes us slaves of death. That's why Lucretius tries to make people accept death so that they don't become its slaves and deeply understand the value of life. In fact, this book tries so that people can understand the value of this unique and infinitely short but valuable opportunity. It's interesting to know that Lucretius' intellectual atmosphere is very similar to the intellectual atmosphere of 5 legends of Persian poetry, namely Hafez, Rumi, Sadi, Khayyam, and Ferdowsi, that we've used their poems many times in the previous episodes of the Elixir of Awareness channel. Lucretius considers it a great evil that people think they know the great secret of the world. That is to say, he considers it a mistake for people to impose form on the formless world. And he considers the greatest error to be that people think that their idea of the world and its creator is the completely truth, while not all of it's the truth. By reading this ancient poem, a person realizes his mortality and insignificance and then reaches a conscious humility. Then at this very moment, at the height of humility, he's overwhelmed with meaning and pride for being able to live in this moment. And this is a very important paradox. The paradox of being small but being important, and the paradox of being mortal but being unique, if understood correctly, can release life force through humans in the world. This understanding can solve all prejudices and violence in itself. And of course, after the release of this book and its poems, this happened gradually in Europe as well. This simple approval and this unconditional acceptance of life and this respect for all living things is something that exists in the essence of all of us human beings, and Lucretius' poem only clears its dust and reveals it again. In fact, it reminds people of life again, and this is the important power of these poems. These poems remind humans of themselves and remind us that no one is happier than the one who lives rightly and honestly. Another point about this book is that these poems are full of gratitude of a person who's discovered only a small and wonderful part of the secret of the world. Someone who's understood only one pixel of the whole mysterious picture of the world, and now, apart from wanting something, only two things have taken over his existence: amazement and a sense of a great responsibility. Once again, we must remind that these ideas were released in a world that was covered by death and darkness, and for years, nothing was mentioned like it in that period. Imagine how much these words could be life-saving in the days when the owners of the church had drawn their most ugly faces like a mask to the face of God. When Poggio took a copy of the book on the nature of things out from the monastery, he immediately sent the book to his close friend Niccolò Niccoli in Florence. His friend read the book, and he was so excited that he immediately wrote another copy of the book in his own beautiful handwriting and gave it to several other friends to read as well. Ancient poetry was slowly waking up. Only 50 manuscripts of that century exist today, indicating that many copies of that book were reproduced in those years. Years later, with the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, many printed copies of the book were published quickly. The book on the nature of things quickly attracted the attention of great thinkers and philosophers of the world. For example, a young Florentine philosopher was drinking from the knowledge of that book and publishing it. The effects of this poem can also be found in all his works. He was none other than Niccolò Machiavelli, who's considered the father of the modern science of politics. Many people mistakenly think that Machiavelli's book called The Prince is the cowardly advice of this philosopher to show a kind of atrocities. But this idea isn't correct, because the works of that period must be decoded somehow and we must read them intelligently. The clever point of The Prince's book isn't about prescribing and encouraging oppression, but about exposing oppression. In fact, Machiavelli is describing and exposing his time. Lucretius' poem has important footprints in other places as well. For example, in the 15th century, this book reached the hands of Thomas More, an important English philosopher and politician. Thomas More, who was himself a devout Catholic Christian, first experiences a paradoxical of love and hate sense with the book on the nature of things. It means that he liked the book, but he was not happy with this feeling. But gradually, he's completely fascinated by that book, and the book causes a tremendous earthquake in Thomas More's thoughts, which later, as the Chancellor of England, makes him carry out important reforms and also makes him write one of the most important masterpieces in the history of philosophy. It means the Book of Utopia. The book Utopia describes the beginning of England and Europe's history in the form of a story. That the situation at that time is officially a disaster. It's a place where the reveler nobles and lords live in luxury, and poverty, hunger, and insecurity have spread everywhere. But the Church, based on its interpretation of Christ's teachings, constantly tells people that poverty isn't such a bad thing and that it's a way to achieve happiness and be cleansed of sins. For example, it's interesting to know that during the time of Henry VIII, that is, in the 14th and 15th centuries, when our story takes place, only 72,000 gallows were erected in England, while each of which had a corpse hanging from it. In this situation, More narrates the story of a person's journey that goes to an unknown place very far away, which strangely contrasted with the world of that time in England. More's Utopia is a place that resembles the idea of Lucretius, in which life is valuable. A place where people could participate in the construction of their society in peace and tolerance. Where the most important sin is prejudice and imposing one's opinions on others. And More's Utopia is a place where people are allowed to seek happiness in their own way. The fact that the location of Thomas More's Utopia is a remote and uncertain place helped the author to visualize concepts and feelings that he couldn't easily convey to his audience in the form of an uncertain place. This book of Mr. Thomas More came out and was published in a world where for a long time practically no one could even imagine a dream and a wish. It means that people had blocked their imagination at that time, and Mr. More's book revived the power of imagination in people. In the same dark age, that is around the 15th century, a young monk named Giordano Bruno was also reading the book on the nature of things. Bruno had realized a few years ago that the church had distorted the teachings of Christ, and he could no longer live in the small and dark cell that the priests had built at that time. Therefore, the book on the nature of things ignited his passion for life. Giordano Bruno had migrated to England for more freedom, and it can be said that his works were extremely important and informative in that period. But in 1591, he returned to Italy with the invitation of an apparently critical, influential person, but that person betrayed Bruno, and he introduced the way to the Inquisition court. He was imprisoned for 8 years and was interrogated, tried, and tortured. And of course, during all that time, he was questioning the right of the inspectors to measure people's faith. And finally, the court verdict was announced, and he was sentenced to be burned alive. On February 17, 1600, Giordano Bruno was taken to the large square of the city to execute the sentence. A German chronicler who was there wrote that when the court judgment was read to him, he just answered in a calm tone, "You should be more afraid of this judgment that you issued than me, who accepts it." So after that sentences, they ordered bridle on his tongue. That is, the soldiers put a nail in his tongue and cheek, and then the sentence was executed, and Giordano Bruno was burned alive and turned into ashes. But this was not the end of the work. To completely destroy his work, they even threw his ashes to the wind, but unaware that the wind spread the particles of existence and thought of this life-loving monotheist throughout the world for centuries. Time passed, and it gradually became clear that it's almost impossible to return the ideas of the book on the nature of things to the Dark Ages. The book was read by most of the famous artists of the world, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Botticelli, and the effect of this book was seen in all kinds of works of art. One of the most important persons who was fascinated by the ideas of Lucretius was William Shakespeare. Today, traces of this influence can be seen in most of his plays, such as Romeo and Juliet. Francis Bacon, Montaigne, Galileo, Newton, Charles Darwin, Thomas Jefferson, Spencer, and a large number of intellectuals and artists during several centuries after the appearance of this book considered its ideas correct and were influenced by it. Now the forbidden door of the ancient world had been opened, and its ideas were gradually spreading everywhere for the centuries, and the church was gradually retreating so that life could slowly come forward. Poggio Bracciolini died on October 30th, 1459, at the age of 79, without even knowing what a great contribution he made to the world. He gave a new life to a book, and in return that book also gave a new life to his world. Our final question to you is, what book changed your life forever? What's your story? Please share your comments with us. Thank you for staying with us till the end of this episode.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.